The fog lay thick over Baker Street that November evening, transforming the familiar thoroughfare into a ghostly procession of muffled sounds and wavering gaslight. I sat before the fire, attempting to make sense of the morning's correspondence, while Sherlock Holmes occupied himself with what appeared to be a systematic destruction of our sitting room's breathable atmosphere. His chemical apparatus bubbled and hissed upon the side table, filling the air with acrid fumes that would have driven a lesser man to seek refuge elsewhere. Holmes himself seemed oblivious to the discomfort, his sharp profile illuminated by the dancing flames as he held a test tube to the light with the reverence of a priest examining a sacred relic. "You have read the same letter 3 times, Watson," he observed, without turning from his work. "Either it contains news of extraordinary import, or your mind is elsewhere entirely. Given that it bears the unmistakable watermark of your publisher and arrived by the second post, I deduce the latter. You are composing, mentally, your account of our recent adventure with the Boscombe Valley mystery." I lowered the letter in some annoyance, though his deduction was, as usual, perfectly accurate. Before I could frame a suitable retort, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed from the stairwell, followed by Mrs. Hudson's apologetic voice and an urgent knock upon our door. At Holmes's languid invitation to enter, Inspector Lestrade burst into our chambers in a state of agitation I had rarely witnessed in that normally composed officer of the law. Lestrade's usually immaculate appearance was dishevelled, his face pale beneath the gaslight, and his breathing laboured as though he had run the entire distance from Scotland Yard. He declined my offer of brandy with a distracted wave and launched immediately into his account, pacing before the fireplace with the restless energy of a caged animal. A murder had been committed that very afternoon, he explained, at Grosvenor House, the London residence of Mr. Cornelius Ashford, a wealthy banker whose financial empire had made him one of the most influential men in the city. The victim was Ashford himself, found dead in his private study at precisely 4 o'clock, stabbed through the heart with an ornamental dagger from his own collection of Eastern antiquities. Holmes had been listening with his eyes closed, but now he opened them and fixed Lestrade with that peculiar intense gaze that indicated his fullest attention. The inspector continued, his voice growing more strained with each detail. Ashford had been hosting his weekly salon that afternoon, a gathering of prominent literary and political figures that had become a fixture of London society. 12 guests had been present, including a cabinet minister, 2 members of Parliament, and several distinguished authors whose names graced the finest drawing rooms in England. What made the case extraordinary, Lestrade revealed, was not merely the murder itself, but the impossible circumstances surrounding it. Mr. Ashford had been seen alive and in perfect health by all 12 guests at 4:30, a full 30 minutes after the police surgeon had determined the time of death at 4 o'clock precisely, allowing perhaps 5 minutes in either direction. The surgeon, Dr. Murdoch of Brook Street, was a man whose professional reputation Lestrade vouched for without reservation, and his examination had been thorough and methodical. Holmes sprang from his chair with that sudden transformation from languid indifference to coiled energy that I had witnessed countless times before. The impossible nature of the case seemed to invigorate rather than perplex him, and his eyes gleamed with the peculiar light that indicated a problem worthy of his extraordinary faculties. He began pacing the room with quick, nervous steps, his long fingers twitching behind his back in that characteristic gesture of intense mental activity. "Fascinating, Lestrade," he murmured, pausing to fix the inspector with his penetrating gaze. "You present us with a contradiction that defies the natural order. A man cannot be simultaneously dead and alive. Yet apparently Mr. Cornelius Ashford has achieved this remarkable feat. Pray give me the details in their proper sequence. Who were these 12 witnesses to this impossible resurrection? Lestrade consulted his notebook with evident relief at having transferred this burden to more capable hands. A distinguished gathering, Mr. Holmes. The Right Honourable Charles Pennington, from the Admiralty, Sir Felix Darrow the novelist, Lady Amelia Kent with her companion, Miss Grey, 2 members of Parliament, a French gentleman named Le Maire, who was a close friend of Ashford's, the deceased's own niece, Miss Clara Ashford, and several others of similar standing. All swear that Ashford was among them at 4:30, speaking and moving about the drawing-room as naturally as you or I. And the discovery of the body? Holmes pressed, his fingers now steepled beneath his chin. Made by the butler, Hargreaves, at 5:15. He had gone to summon his master for an important telephone call from Paris. Finding the study door locked from within, he grew alarmed when repeated knocking brought no response. With the help of 2 footmen, they forced the door and found Ashford slumped over his desk, an ornamental dagger from his own collection driven between his shoulder blades. Holmes nodded slowly, absorbing each detail with the precision of a recording instrument. The room itself showed no signs of disturbance beyond the tragedy. None whatsoever. The windows were fastened from the inside, the door locked as I mentioned. There is no other means of entry or exit. Some papers were scattered about the desk, but that appeared to be the result of Ashford's final struggle. Within minutes, we were seated in a police carriage, rattling through the fog-shrouded streets toward Grosvenor House. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his head thrown back against the cushions, and his eyes closed, though I knew from long experience that this apparent repose masked the most intense mental activity. Lestrade fidgeted nervously beside us, occasionally attempting to elaborate upon his initial account, but Holmes seemed deaf to all external stimuli. The Ashford residence proved to be a magnificent Georgian structure that dominated the corner of the square, its windows blazing with light despite the tragedy that had befallen its master. A constable stood guard at the entrance, and we were immediately admitted into a marble-floored hall where several individuals waited in various states of distress and barely controlled indignation. The enforced detention had clearly not sat well with guests accustomed to moving freely through the highest circles of society. A distinguished gentleman with silver hair and military bearing stepped forward, introducing himself as Sir Edmund Hartley. Behind him stood a younger man whose resemblance to the deceased suggested family connection, his face pale and his hands clenched tightly at his sides. This proved to be Philip Ashford, the banker's nephew, and, according to Lestrade's whispered information, his principal heir. Holmes acknowledged these introductions with barely concealed impatience, his attention already focused upon the staircase that led to the upper floors where the study awaited our examination. He instructed Lestrade to ensure that all guests remained available for questioning and that nothing in the sealed room had been disturbed since the police surgeon's initial examination. With these arrangements confirmed, we ascended to the scene of the crime, leaving behind us the murmur of anxious voices and the rustle of expensive clothing in the entrance hall below. The study door stood slightly ajar, sealed with official notices, and as Lestrade produced the key and admitted us, I was struck immediately by the heavy atmosphere that seemed to cling to the room like a shroud. The metallic scent of blood mingled with the lingering aroma of fine tobacco, while the green-shaded lamp upon the desk cast eerie shadows across the leather-bound volumes that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Holmes paused upon the threshold, his nostrils flaring as he absorbed the scene, his keen eyes darting from the heavy curtains that shrouded the windows to the rich Persian carpet beneath our feet. At my friend's signal, I approached the desk where the tragedy had occurred, though the body had naturally been removed for the coroner's examination. Dark stains upon the leather surface and carpet told their own grim tale, while the scattered papers spoke of the victim's final, desperate moments. I knelt to examine the bloodstains more closely, noting their pattern and distribution, while Holmes dropped to the floor near the doorway, his magnifying glass in hand, as he scrutinized every fibre of the carpet's weave with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient manuscripts. For nearly 20 minutes, Holmes conducted his examination with the methodical precision that had made his reputation throughout London, moving about the room like a hunting dog, following an invisible but compelling scent. He began with the carpet itself, dropping to his hands and knees near the doorway and working his way systematically toward the desk. His magnifying glass caught the lamplight as he scrutinized every fibre, occasionally making small exclamations that conveyed nothing to my ear, but were evidently of great significance to his extraordinary mind. "The carpet tells us much by what it does not reveal, Watson," he remarked, rising and dusting off his trouser knees with a fastidious grimace. "No muddy boot prints, no traces of gravel from the street, and indeed remarkably little dust at all. Whoever entered this room did so with exceptional care, or else they never left the house to begin with." He moved toward the windows, pulling back the heavy velvet drapes to reveal the fog pressing against the glass like grey wool. His examination of the latches was minute, his nose almost touching the brass fittings as he studied them through his lens. "Fastened securely, and the dust upon the sill remains unbroken," he announced with satisfaction. "We may dismiss the windows as points of entry or exit. We are dealing, as you suspected, Lestrade, with a puzzle contained entirely within these four walls." He turned his attention next to the writing desk, where I had been studying the scattered papers with growing interest. Among the documents lay an unfinished letter, the ink still bearing a slight smear where the writer's hand had jerked suddenly. "He was writing to his solicitor, Mr. Trelawney," I observed, "regarding a modification of his will. The letter is dated today, and see here, Holmes, the final word is blotted as though his hand was startled by some sudden shock." Holmes leaned over my shoulder, his keen eyes scanning the half-finished correspondence with intense concentration. He lifted the paper delicately, holding it to the light and examining both the ink and the watermark with equal attention. "Observe the pen, Watson." The gold-nibbed instrument lay several feet away, its point bent from the impact of falling. Ashford was left-handed, a fact which explains the distinctive wear pattern on the nib. Yet the pen lies to the right of where he fell, suggesting he flung it aside in his final moments. Holmes picked up the pen with his handkerchief, turning it over in the lamplight before replacing it exactly where he had found it. His attention shifted to a small side table near the fireplace, where a silver tray held a crystal decanter and a single glass containing the dregs of amber liquid. Holmes lifted the stopper of the decanter and inhaled deeply, then examined the glass with particular care, holding it against the green light of the desk lamp. "Brandy of excellent vintage," he murmured. "But observe the rim, Watson. What do you make of that faint residue?" I squinted at the crystal, detecting a barely visible smudge along the edge. Some form of grease. Perhaps. Precisely. The type used for theatrical makeup or to protect the skin in harsh weather. Yet Ashford was a banker, not an actor, and he had not been outdoors today. Holmes replaced the glass with extreme care, his expression thoughtful. "We have here a contradiction of habit, gentlemen. The man who drank from this glass was not behaving as Cornelius Ashford would normally behave." He crossed to the fireplace, where the remains of a coal fire still glowed among the ashes. Using the poker, he stirred the embers gently, extracting several partially burned fragments of paper which he spread upon the hearth for examination. "Financial documents," he announced after a brief study, "but deliberately destroyed. Someone took pains to eliminate evidence, yet was interrupted before the task could be completed." Holmes then turned his attention to the ornate display case mounted upon the wall, where Eastern daggers and scimitars hung upon velvet backing beneath unbroken glass. "The weapon was taken from this collection," he observed, studying the empty space in the center of the display. "Yet there are no signs of forced entry into the case itself. Therefore, whoever removed the dagger either possessed a key or had sufficient time and privacy to employ more delicate means." Near the corner of the room, an ashtray upon a side table caught his eye. It contained the remains of 2 cigars, and Holmes examined each with the reverence of a scholar studying ancient manuscripts. "Excellent," he murmured, lifting one fragment delicately. "A Havana Corona of the finest quality, exactly what one would expect from a man of Ashford's refined tastes. The other, however, is of decidedly inferior make, harsh and cheap. The ash pattern has been disturbed, suggesting the tray was moved after the cigars were smoked." Lestrade shifted impatiently. "Surely visitors might smoke inferior tobacco, Mr. Holmes. There is nothing particularly murderous about a cheap cigar." "In itself, no," Holmes replied with a thin smile. "Combined with other observations, it may prove the lever that shifts our entire understanding of the case." He moved to the desk and carefully lifted a leather-bound appointment diary that lay open to the current week's entries. His examination was thorough, studying not only the visible pages but holding the volume at various angles to detect impressions from previous writings. "Watson, your medical expertise, if you please," he said suddenly, straightening from the diary. "The police surgeon determined death occurred at 4 o'clock. What factors might affect the reliability of such a determination?" I considered the question carefully, sensing that Holmes was testing some theory already forming in his remarkable mind. Body temperature, rigor mortis, and lividity provide reasonably accurate indicators within certain limits. However, environmental factors can significantly affect these calculations. Unusual heat or cold, the victim's physical condition, even the circumstances of death itself, might alter the normal progression. "Precisely," Holmes murmured, though whether in agreement or mere acknowledgement I could not determine. He returned to the door and examined the lock mechanism with minute attention, producing a small set of tools from his pocket and manipulating the tumblers several times while listening intently to their operation. "This lock has been recently oiled," he announced with evident satisfaction. "The mechanism operates with unusual smoothness for a fixture of this age. Someone has taken considerable pains to ensure it functions silently and efficiently." He paused, studying the key that still protruded from the inner side of the door. "And observe, Lestrade, the key itself. Do you notice anything particular about the shaft?" The inspector leaned closer, frowning. "It appears normal to me, Mr. Holmes." "Look again. In the grooves of the metal there are traces of white wax, a very specific type, I should say, used by locksmiths and those who work with delicate mechanisms." Holmes straightened, his eyes gleaming with that peculiar light that indicated a problem worthy of his extraordinary faculties. "We have before us a locked room, a murdered man, and 12 witnesses who swear they saw him alive 30 minutes after his death. Yet each piece of evidence tells us a different story, and the contradictions are becoming most illuminating." He surveyed the room one final time, his gaze sweeping across every surface as though committing the entire scene to memory. "I have seen enough for the present. Let us interview these distinguished witnesses and hear their accounts of this impossible afternoon. The human element, Watson, may prove even more revealing than the physical evidence, and I suspect we are about to encounter contradictions that will make this locked room seem simplicity itself. We descended once more to the great hall, where the assembled guests waited with the strained patience of those accustomed to commanding their own time, but finding themselves subject to the inexorable demands of a murder investigation. The drawing-room into which we were ushered was a magnificent chamber whose gilt mirrors and crystal chandeliers spoke of wealth accumulated over generations, yet the splendour seemed muted by the tragedy that had befallen its master. Holmes paused in the doorway, his sharp eyes cataloguing each individual with that peculiar intensity that seemed to strip away social pretense and reveal the essential character beneath. The fog pressed against the tall windows like grey wool, and the fire roared in the marble hearth, yet there was a chill in the air that no amount of coal could dispel. Inspector Lestrade cleared his throat with an air of self-importance that ill-concealed his continuing discomposure, addressing the company with the deference due to their station while maintaining the authority of his office. Holmes stepped forward with his customary air of cold courtesy, bowing slightly to acknowledge their inconvenience while making it clear that his questions would brook no evasion. I shall require individual interviews to avoid the contamination that occurs when memories are shared and unconsciously harmonized, Holmes announced, his tone brooking no argument despite the immediate protests from several quarters. We shall begin with those who can provide the most comprehensive view of the household's activities today. He requested that Hargreaves, the butler, be brought to the library across the hall, a suggestion that produced a dignified nod from that worthy servant. The butler entered with the measured tread of long service, though his composure had evidently been severely tested by the day's events. He was a man in his 60s, with the ramrod bearing that spoke of a lifetime spent in the service of quality, yet his hands trembled slightly as he took the chair Holmes indicated. His account of discovering the body matched Lestrade's earlier description in every particular, delivered in the flat, careful tones of a man determined to maintain professional dignity despite personal distress. 23 years I have served Mr. Brigham. Ashford? Hargreaves said in response to Holmes's gentle inquiry, his voice catching slightly at this display of emotion. I can say without reservation that he was a fair and generous master, Mr. Holmes, though I confess his behaviour today was somewhat irregular. The butler's brow furrowed with concentration as he considered the morning's events. He came down to breakfast at his usual hour, but seemed distracted, preoccupied. He barely touched his kippers, which was most unlike him, and requested that I bring his post directly to his study rather than to the breakfast room, as was his invariable custom. Holmes leaned forward with quickening interest. His correspondence was of particular note today. Several letters bearing foreign postmarks, sir. One from Paris, I believe, and another from Vienna. He read them in his study with the door closed, which again was somewhat unusual. Mr. Ashford generally attended to his correspondence in plain view, having nothing to hide from his household. Hargreaves paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. There was also the matter of Monsieur le Maire's presence. He arrived from Paris only yesterday and was staying as Mr. Ashford's personal guest in the East Wing, though I confess I was surprised by his reception. In what respect? Holmes's voice remained casual, but I detected the sharpening of his attention. I had understood from previous conversations that Mr. Ashford and Monsieur le Maire had dissolved their business partnership some months ago following a disagreement, yet here was the French gentleman installed as an honoured guest. There was some tension at luncheon between Monsieur le Maire and young Mr. Philip Ashford. Nothing overt, you understand, but one develops an instinct for such atmospheres after years of service. Holmes dismissed the butler with thanks and immediately requested that Sir Edmund Hartley be brought in next. The distinguished gentleman entered with the authority of a man accustomed to deference, his military bearing evident in every line of his figure despite his advanced years. He took his seat with evident reluctance, as though submission to questioning offended some ingrained sense of hierarchy, yet his account proved both precise and illuminating. "I spoke to Cornelius at 20 minutes to 4, Sir Edmund replied to Holmes's opening inquiry. "We were in the drawing-room," he excused himself, saying he must attend to a private matter in his study, and that he would rejoin us within half an hour. His conduct was entirely in character, though I dare say there was a certain strain about him that I had not observed before. The older man's eyes grew distant as he recalled the scene. A tendency to distraction, as though his mind were continually returning to some vexing matter. When Lady Amelia spoke of a recent scandal in society, he made an uncharacteristic remark about how a man's whole life might be overturned by the revelation of some long-buried secret. Holmes's fingers tapped lightly upon the arm of his chair. "Describe his return at 4:30 with as much precision as your memory allows." The door opened, and Cornelius entered quite as usual. He apologized for his delay, made some remark about being detained by an urgent communication, and crossed to the sideboard to pour himself a brandy. He then moved among the guests, exchanging a few words here and there. There was no sign of illness or distress, no pallor or disarrangement of clothing. Sir Edmund's voice carried the conviction of absolute certainty. "If he had just been murdered in his study, Mr. Holmes, I confess he hid it with astonishing skill." Holmes allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "You will agree, then, that if 12 respectable witnesses testify to the same apparent impossibility, the explanation must be sought not in their collective deception, but in some illusion which deceived them all alike." The next witness Holmes requested was Miss Clara Ashford, and the young lady who stepped forward bore the unmistakable marks of genuine grief. She was slender, with dark eyes that had clearly known little rest since the tragedy, and her gloved hands twisted a lace handkerchief almost to shreds as she took the vacated seat. Her voice was low but steady as she confirmed her continuous presence in the drawing-room, listening attentively to Lady Amelia's performance of one of Chopin's nocturnes. "Of course I saw my uncle at 4:30, she said, in response to Holmes's gentle inquiry. "He came in, as Sir Edmund described. But there was something—" She hesitated, biting her lip before continuing. "When he greeted me, he laid his hand upon my shoulder for a moment. It was very cold, as though he had been walking outside in the wind without a coat. I thought it strange, because the house is always warm and he disliked draughts." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "An unusual observation, Miss Ashford, and a highly important one. You noticed nothing else? No peculiarity of voice, step, or expression?" She shook her head slowly. He smiled at me as he always did, though perhaps the smile did not quite reach his eyes. But then I had already sensed that something weighed upon his mind these last weeks. He would often sit alone in his study for hours, and he spoke of business anxieties that were unlike him. As Miss Ashford returned to the drawing-room, Holmes turned to me with an expression of deep concentration. "We begin to perceive the outline of a most audacious scheme, Watson. A murdered banker, a French business partner with a mysterious history, and witnesses who swear they saw a dead man walking. The cold touch Miss Ashford described is particularly significant, suggesting that whoever they encountered at 4:30 was not behaving as a living man would normally behave." He moved to the window, staring out into the fog-shrouded square. "Let us now hear what Monsieur le Maire has to say for himself. I suspect his account will prove the most illuminating of all, for he alone among our witnesses has travelled from Paris to be present at this impossible crime. Monsieur Henri Lemaire entered the library with the fluid grace of a continental gentleman, though beneath his studied composure I detected that peculiar tension which marks a man walking upon uncertain ground. He was perhaps 45 years of age, immaculately dressed in the Parisian fashion, with sharp, intelligent features and a pointed black beard that lent him an almost theatrical appearance. His dark eyes moved restlessly about the room, and when he took the seat Holmes indicated, his gloved hands betrayed a slight tremor that suggested nerves held under rigid control. "You will understand, monsieur," Holmes began with icy politeness, "that our questions, though perhaps disagreeable, are unfortunately necessary. I am given to understand that your business relationship with Mr. Ashford ended under circumstances of some difficulty." Lemaire's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "For 10 years, Cornelius and I were partners in various enterprises, principally investments in the Balkans and South America. We made considerable profits together, but recently there were disagreements. Allegations were made regarding our conduct toward certain shareholders. Ashford wished to distance himself from these accusations, even at the cost of my reputation. We parted on terms that were professionally strained." He paused, examining his manicured fingernails with apparent casualness. "However, 3 weeks ago I received an urgent letter requesting that I come to London. He hinted at information that could affect both our interests, spoke of enemies and buried secrets. Naturally I came." Holmes leaned forward with quickening interest. "And the nature of these buried secrets?" "He was evasive when I arrived yesterday evening. Said only that we would discuss everything after this afternoon's salon, when the house was quiet. That conversation will now never take place." Lemaire's expression grew genuinely troubled. "I confess, Monsieur Holmes, that I am left wondering what secrets died with him in that locked study." "Your movements this afternoon," Holmes continued in the same level tone. "You were present in the drawing-room throughout?" "From 3 o'clock until the police arrived," Lemaire replied promptly. "I was engaged in conversation with Lady Amelia regarding the political situation in France. When Cornelius rejoined us at 4:30, I attempted to catch his eye, hoping for some signal regarding our postponed discussion. He looked directly at me, but there was something disturbing in his expression. A blankness, as though he were performing the role of Cornelius Ashford, rather than being him." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden intensity. "You shook hands with him?" "I did not, but I observed him closely. His movements seemed stiff, rehearsed. And his hand, when he poured his brandy, appeared unusually cold. I noticed, because he offered me a cigar from his private collection, saying we should forget our differences for the evening. I accepted, though I confess I did not finish it entirely. The English air disagrees with me." Holmes dismissed Lemaire with thanks and immediately requested Lady Amelia Kent. She entered with the languid grace of a woman thoroughly at ease in any drawing-room, though the strain of the afternoon showed in the faint line between her brows. Her fair hair caught the lamplight as she took her seat, and when she spoke, her voice carried the precision of a trained musician. "I understand it is my misfortune to have provided the background music for this dreadful business," she said, before Holmes could speak. "I can tell you precisely what I played and when. Musicians are slaves to time, Mr. Holmes. We measure our lives in bars and beats rather than minutes and seconds." "Your precision will be invaluable," Holmes assured her. "You began with Chopin at 4 o'clock. "Exactly. The nocturne in E minor, which lasts 6 minutes at the proper tempo. I began as the clock chimed the hour. Mr. Ashford left just before I began, at perhaps a minute to 4. muttering something about an expected message. I did not see him again until halfway through my second piece, which I began at 20 minutes past 4. He entered at precisely 28 minutes past the hour. I glanced at the clock because I was considering whether to attempt a third piece before tea. You are quite certain of the interval? Absolutely. He crossed behind me to the sideboard, and his step sounded rather heavy on the parquet. I remember thinking it odd, as he usually moved with such quiet grace. When Lady Amelia had withdrawn, Holmes immediately requested Philip Ashford. The young man entered with the defensive hostility of one accustomed to disapproval, his hands trembling slightly as he lit a cigarette without permission. Holmes observed these signs of nervous strain with evident interest. "You were dependent upon your uncle's generosity," Holmes stated matter-of-factly. "Yet you observed him closely this afternoon. When he returned to the drawing-room at 4:30, did you notice anything unusual?" Philip drew deeply on his cigarette, his eyes narrowing in concentration. "Now that you mention it, there was something odd. My uncle always wore a particular signet ring, a family heirloom with the Ashford crest. When he poured his brandy, I noticed the ring was missing. I had been admiring that ring since childhood, hoping one day it would pass to me. Its absence was immediately apparent." Holmes's fingers tightened upon his chair arm. "You are certain of this observation?" "Absolutely. There was also the matter of his gait. My uncle had suffered a riding injury years ago that left him with a slight limp, barely noticeable but always present. When he crossed the drawing-room that afternoon, he walked without any trace of that familiar hesitation." Holmes sprang to his feet with barely contained excitement. "Inspector Lestrade, I require immediate access to the servants' quarters. There is evidence to be found that will illuminate this entire mystery." We followed Holmes through narrow corridors that formed a hidden network behind the grand public rooms. He moved with purpose, occasionally pausing to examine doorways, his mind clearly working through complex calculations. At last, he stopped before a modest chamber near the back stairs, producing his picks and opening the locked door within seconds. The room contained the sparse furnishings typical of servants' quarters, but Holmes crossed immediately to a wardrobe against the far wall. Flinging open its doors, he examined several suits of livery hanging within, then suddenly let out a low exclamation of triumph. From behind the hanging clothes, he extracted a dark suit of excellent quality, holding it up to the lamplight. "Observe, gentlemen," he said, with barely contained satisfaction, "a suit tailored for a man of Cornelius Ashford's height and build, hidden among the servants' effects. Note the quality of the fabric, the expensive buttons. This is no servant's garment." From the jacket's inner pocket, he withdrew a small theatrical makeup kit containing grease paint, spirit gum, and various implements of disguise. "The tools of transformation," he murmured, examining each item with reverence. "But there is one more piece of evidence we must secure." He led us back to the drawing-room, now empty of guests, and made straight for the fireplace. To my astonishment, he dropped to his knees upon the hearth-rug and began sifting through the ash and debris in the grate with his bare hands. Suddenly he froze, reaching into the furthest corner behind a blackened log to withdraw a small, sodden object, the stub of a cigar, chewed at the end and hastily extinguished. Producing his magnifying glass, he examined the charred remnant with intense concentration, then reached into his waistcoat pocket for the folded paper containing the inferior cigar ash he had collected from the study. He placed the two specimens side by side upon his palm. "Look, Watson," he commanded, his voice trembling with suppressed excitement. "The texture of the leaf, the peculiar dark colour of the ash. This stub, found here in the drawing room, where witnesses swear they saw Ashford smoking at 4:30, is identical to the cheap tobacco smoked by the intruder in the study where Ashford died at 4 o'clock. The implications struck me like a physical blow, but Holmes, Ashford was a connoisseur who would never smoke such inferior tobacco, and Lemaire said he held it in his right hand, yet Ashford was left-handed. Precisely! Holmes sprang up, his eyes blazing with triumph. The man who walked into this room at 4:30, who spoke to the guests and poured a drink, was not Cornelius Ashford. It was his murderer, Watson, a murderer who possessed the audacity to don his victim's clothes, mimic his appearance, and establish an alibi by appearing before 12 witnesses at the very time the police surgeon would later determine as the moment of death. He pocketed the evidence carefully, his expression growing grimly determined. We are dealing with a performer of exceptional skill, someone capable of fooling even the victim's own niece, but in his arrogance he retained his vulgar smoking habits, forgot the missing signet ring, and failed to perfect the subtle limp that marked Ashford's gait. These small vanities have provided us with the thread that will unravel his entire scheme. The fog pressed against the windows like grey wool as Holmes stood silhouetted against the dying fire, his aquiline profile sharp in the lamplight. The impossible has become merely improbable, and the improbable is rapidly resolving into certainty. We have witnessed not resurrection but the most audacious impersonation in the annals of crime. Tomorrow we shall set our trap and force this theatrical murderer to take his final bow. The night had grown late when we returned to Baker Street, and the fog had thickened to such density that our hansom moved through the streets like a ship navigating through cotton wool. Holmes maintained an almost complete silence during the journey, broken only by occasional muttered observations about time intervals and theatrical requirements. Once ensconced in our familiar sitting room, he threw himself into his armchair and remained motionless for nearly an hour, his fingers steepled beneath his chin and his eyes closed in that profound concentration which I had learned never to interrupt. The problem, Watson, is not identifying our murderer, for that has become increasingly apparent, he began at last, reaching for his pipe. The difficulty lies in understanding the precise mechanism of his deception. We have a man who was seen alive by 12 witnesses at a time when medical science insists he was already dead. The murderer has constructed an alibi of such audacious brilliance that proving it will require the most delicate handling. I leaned forward eagerly. You believe the impersonation was accomplished by someone who knew Ashford intimately? More than that, Watson. Consider the requirements. The impersonator needed intimate knowledge of Ashford's habits and mannerisms, access to the house and its secret passages, and the ability to move freely without arousing suspicion. He required theatrical skills sufficient to fool even Ashford's own niece, yet he made crucial errors that betrayed his deception. The missing signet ring, the forgotten limp, the cheap tobacco that contradicted Ashford's refined tastes. Holmes rose and began pacing with quick, nervous steps, but observed the psychological elements as well. Why did Ashford write to his solicitor about changing his will on the very day of his murder? What prompted such urgency, and who stood to benefit most from preventing that new will from being executed? Before I could respond, rapid footsteps echoed from the stairwell, followed by Mrs. Hudson's apologetic voice and an urgent knock. At Holmes's invitation, Inspector Lestrade burst into our chambers in evident agitation, his face flushed and his breathing laboured as though he had run the entire distance from Scotland Yard. "A second incident at Grosvenor House, Mr. Holmes," he announced without preamble.
The safe in Ashford's study has been forced and documents are missing. Hargreaves discovered it an hour after we left. By the time my men forced entry, the intruder had vanished,
leaving only the twisted remains of the lock mechanism. Holmes sprang to his feet with that sudden transformation from languid contemplation to coiled energy. Not forced, I'll wager, but opened with delicate instruments and then damaged to simulate crude violence. What was taken? According to Philip Ashford, mostly financial papers relating to the Balkan investments that caused recent scandal, the same ventures that involved Monsieur le Maire. Lestrade consulted his notebook with evident frustration. No one entered or left the house, Mr. Holmes. My constables were posted at every entrance. It had to be someone already inside. Precisely what our murderer intended us to conclude, Holmes murmured, his eyes gleaming with renewed intensity. The net tightens, Watson. Someone grows desperate enough to risk a return to the scene. Either they fear discovery of evidence they failed to destroy initially, or some new development threatens their carefully constructed alibi. We returned immediately to Grosvenor House, where the atmosphere remained charged with barely suppressed tension. In the library, Miss Clara Ashford waited with evident distress, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief as she had done during our previous interview. Her dark eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of secrets weighing heavily upon her conscience. "Mr. Holmes," she began, in a low voice before we could speak, "there is something I did not tell you before. I lacked the courage, fearing it would cast suspicion upon family, but justice for my uncle must take precedence over my fears." Holmes's manner softened immediately. "You must tell me everything, Miss Ashford."
"Truth is the only weapon we possess against deception." She drew a shuddering breath before continuing. 3 days ago I came upon my uncle and Philip in the study, arguing in raised voices most unlike either of them. I heard only fragments through the door, Philip saying something about ruin if certain truths emerged, and my uncle responding that he preferred honest ruin to continued blackmail. When they realized I was listening, they fell silent immediately. That evening, I saw my uncle burning papers in the fireplace, documents he handled as though they contained poison. Holmes went very still, his piercing gaze fixed upon her pale face. "Your uncle spoke specifically of blackmail?" "He said once that a single letter in the wrong hands could destroy everything he had built. He seemed to live in constant fear these past weeks."
Starting at unexpected sounds and examining his correspondence with unusual care. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I believe someone was threatening him, Mr. Holmes, someone who knew secrets from his business dealings abroad." Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me, his expression growing grimmer. "The missing portfolio from the safe. Our murderer seeks to eliminate the very evidence that drove Ashford to consider changing his will. We move, Watson, from simple murder into the shadowy realm of extortion and buried secrets." As Miss Clara withdrew, Holmes began pacing the library with that restless energy that indicated his mind working at fever pitch. "The pattern becomes clear, Watson. Ashford discovered he was being blackmailed, perhaps by someone he trusted. He summoned Le Maire from Paris, possibly to confront him or seek his counsel. He prepared to alter his will, cutting off whoever threatened him, but his would-be victim struck first, using the most audacious method conceivable." He paused before the window, staring out into the fog-shrouded square. "Tomorrow we shall set our trap. I require certain preparations, theatrical supplies, careful timing, and the cooperation of all our suspects gathered in one room. Our murderer has given his first performance, Inspector. I intend to arrange his second under conditions entirely of my own choosing." The fog pressed against the windows like grey wool as Holmes stood silhouetted against the dying fire, his aquiline profile sharp in the lamplight. Somewhere in the darkness beyond, a desperate killer waited, wondering whether his elaborate charade had succeeded or whether the net was slowly tightening around his neck. The following morning dawned grey and cheerless, with the fog still clinging to Baker Street like funeral shrouds, though it had thinned sufficiently to reveal the familiar outlines of our neighbourhood. Holmes had been awake most of the night, and when I emerged from my chamber at 8 o'clock, I found him surrounded by an extraordinary collection of materials spread across our sitting-room table with methodical precision. Theatrical makeup, spirit gum, various items of clothing, and a detailed floor plan of Grosvenor House lay arranged like the instruments of some elaborate surgical procedure. "Ah, Watson, excellent timing," he said, without looking up from his work, where he was marking various points on the house plan with a red pencil. "I require your assistance in a small experiment regarding the crucial timing of yesterday's events. You recall Lady Amelia's precise account. 6 minutes for the Chopin nocturne, then a 14-minute interval before her second piece. That provides our murderer with exactly 20 minutes to commit his crime, effect his transformation, and return to the drawing-room as his victim." He rose and began demonstrating with quick, precise movements that spoke of hours spent in calculation. "Consider the requirements, Watson. First, the murder itself, a swift attack from behind while Ashford sits at his desk, occupied with correspondence. The dagger thrust requires perhaps 30 seconds, allowing for the victim's brief struggle. Then our performer must remove Ashford's jacket, waistcoat and cravat, don them himself, apply sufficient makeup to alter his appearance, and rehearse the deceased's manner of walking and speaking." Holmes moved about the room as he spoke, miming each action with theatrical precision that was both fascinating and chilling to observe. 20 minutes seems impossible, yet it can be accomplished if every movement is rehearsed to perfection. Our murderer studied Ashford's habits intimately, not merely his appearance, but his gestures, his voice, even the peculiar way he tilted his head when listening. This was no spontaneous crime of passion, but a performance planned with meticulous care over days or perhaps weeks. I watched in fascination as Holmes demonstrated the transformation, applying grease paint to alter his own features with swift, practiced strokes. The change was remarkable, subtle yet effective. But surely the guests would have noticed if someone was missing from the drawing room during those crucial 20 minutes. "Precisely the question that occupied my thoughts through the night," Holmes replied, removing the makeup with equal efficiency. "Lady Amelia was absorbed in her musical performance. Sir Edmund was engaged in political discussion with the cabinet minister. The others were scattered about the room in various conversations. In such circumstances, a single absence might pass unnoticed, particularly if the absent party had established a pattern of moving about the room, stepping out briefly for air or other purposes." He consulted his notes with evident satisfaction, then moved to his desk to compose several telegrams. "I have made inquiries to Paris and Vienna regarding certain business dealings that may prove illuminating. More immediately, I have instructed Lestrade to summon all our principals to Grosvenor House at 3 o'clock this afternoon. The stage must be set for our final act, and I intend to recreate the conditions of yesterday's salon as precisely as possible." The hours until our appointment crawled by with agonizing slowness. Holmes occupied himself with chemical experiments that filled our chambers with acrid smoke, while I attempted unsuccessfully to concentrate on the morning papers. At 2:30 we departed for Grosvenor House in a four-wheeler, Holmes carrying a leather case whose contents he refused to divulge despite my repeated inquiries. The assembled company awaited us in the drawing-room, their faces displaying various degrees of anxiety, irritation, and barely concealed hostility at being summoned once more to the scene of tragedy. Philip Ashford stood by the fireplace, smoking nervously and avoiding eye contact with the others. Monsieur le Maire occupied a chair near the window, his dark eyes watchful and calculating behind their facade of continental courtesy. Lady Amelia sat at the piano, her fingers absently tracing silent patterns on the keys, while Sir Edmund maintained his military bearing despite evident impatience with the proceedings. Holmes entered with that peculiar air of controlled excitement that I had learned to recognize as the prelude to revelation. He positioned himself before the fireplace, his hawk-like features illuminated by the dancing flames, and surveyed the assembled suspects with the intensity of a naturalist studying specimens under glass. The atmosphere in the room grew thick with tension as he prepared to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began in that clear, incisive voice that commanded immediate attention, "you have been summoned here because each of you possesses knowledge crucial to resolving the mystery of Cornelius Ashford's death. Some of you have withheld information, whether from misguided loyalty or calculated self-interest. Others among you have participated, knowingly or unknowingly, in a deception of remarkable audacity." Philip Ashford's face flushed with anger, his cigarette trembling between his fingers. "See here, Mr. Holmes, if you're suggesting that any of us had anything to do with my uncle's murder—" Holmes raised a hand for silence,
his gesture carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "I suggest nothing yet, Mr. Ashford. I merely state facts as they have emerged through careful investigation. Your uncle was murdered at 4 o'clock in his study, stabbed from behind while engaged in correspondence with his solicitor. The weapon was an ornamental dagger from his own collection, selected precisely because it would point suspicion toward no particular individual." He began pacing before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic pose of deep concentration. The murderer then accomplished something truly extraordinary. He transformed himself into a passable imitation of his victim and appeared before you all at 4:30, establishing an alibi that seemed to defy the very laws of nature.
12 witnesses swore they saw Ashford alive 30 minutes after his death, creating an impossibility that has baffled even the finest minds at Scotland Yard. Monsieur le Maire leaned forward with evident interest, though I detected a slight tremor in his voice. "You claim to have solved this impossibility, Monsieur Holmes?" "I claim nothing, monsieur. I demonstrate." Holmes opened his leather case and began withdrawing the evidence collected during our investigation, the cheap cigar stub, samples of theatrical makeup, fragments of the suit hidden in the servants' quarters. Each item he displayed with the flourish of a master conjurer, revealing the mechanism behind a seemingly impossible illusion. The man who walked into this room at 4:30 yesterday made several crucial errors that betrayed his masquerade. He forgot the signet ring that Ashford wore constantly, a family heirloom that would never have been removed. He walked without the slight limp caused by an old riding injury, moving with a confidence that contradicted years of physical habit. His hands were unnaturally cold, as Miss Clara observed, because he had just come from committing murder, and the shock of his crime had driven the blood from his extremities. Holmes paused, allowing these revelations to settle upon his audience like falling snow, each detail adding weight to his inexorable logic. Most damning of all, he smoked a cheap cigar in direct contradiction of Ashford's refined tastes, a habit so ingrained that even in the stress of impersonation he could not abandon it. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the steady drumming of rain against the tall windows and the soft hiss of gas flames in their fixtures. Holmes moved to the centre of the room, his presence dominating the space as he prepared to tighten the net around his quarry. But these errors pale beside one fundamental miscalculation, he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing his audience to strain forward to catch every word. The murderer assumed that medical science could determine time of death with absolute precision, that the police surgeon's estimate would be accepted without question. He built his entire elaborate alibi upon this assumption, timing his appearance before witnesses to create what seemed an impossible contradiction. Sir Edmund frowned deeply, his military mind grappling with the implications. "Are you suggesting the surgeon was mistaken about the time of death?" "Not mistaken, Sir Edmund, but working with incomplete information. Body temperature, rigor mortis, and other indicators provide estimates within certain parameters, not absolute certainties. But what if our murderer possessed sufficient medical knowledge to manipulate these very indicators? What if he created conditions that would mislead even an experienced physician about the precise moment of death?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with cold triumph as he delivered his masterstroke. "Consider this possibility. Ashford died not at 4 o'clock, but earlier, at 20 minutes to 4, just as he left this room to attend to his urgent matter. That would provide our murderer with 40 minutes instead of 20, time enough to commit murder, effect his transformation with careful attention to detail, and return to establish his alibi before witnesses who would swear to his innocence." A collective gasp ran through the assembled company, and I saw several faces go pale as the full implications of Holmes's deduction became clear. The detective smiled thinly, his satisfaction evident as he watched his logic take hold in their minds. "The stage is now set," Holmes announced, his voice carrying a note of finality that sent a chill through the room. "Our murderer sits among us, believing his performance was flawless, confident that his audacious gamble has succeeded. But every actor, no matter how skilled, eventually faces his final curtain call. The only question that remains is whether he will take his bow gracefully, or whether we must force him from the shadows into the harsh light of justice." The tension in the room had become almost unbearable, each person studying the others with new suspicion, wondering which among them harbored the soul of a killer. Holmes stood motionless in the center of it all, a master puppeteer, watching his marionettes dance to strings only he could see, waiting for the moment when pressure and fear would force the guilty party to reveal himself through some desperate, final gambit. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault against the windows, while within the drawing-room of Grosvenor House, the ghost of Cornelius Ashford seemed to hover in the shadows, waiting for his murderer to step forward and claim responsibility for the most audacious crime in the annals of London's criminal history.
Holmes allowed the silence to stretch until the very air seemed to vibrate with tension, then suddenly transformed his manner from dramatic revelation to methodical scientist. "We shall not proceed further by accusation alone," he declared, with crisp authority. "We shall proceed by demonstration. You have each provided your account of yesterday's events, and now we shall test them against the immutable laws of time and space." He crossed to the ornate mantel clock, its steady ticking suddenly audible in the hushed room. "We begin at 3 minutes to 4, the moment when, according to unanimous testimony, Mr. Ashford left this drawing-room for his study." His gaze swept the assembled company with surgical precision. "Lady Amelia, if you please, resume your position at the piano exactly as yesterday."
"And you mentioned being a slave to time. Permit us to benefit from that precision." Despite visible reluctance, Lady Amelia seated herself and lifted her hands to the keys. Holmes then positioned each suspect with the meticulous care of a stage director, adjusting chairs and directing movements until the tableau matched his exacting requirements. Sir Edmund, by the fireplace in conversation with your imaginary cabinet minister. Monsieur le Maire, near the window, Mr. Philip Ashford, on the sofa where you admitted to brooding over your quarrel, Miss Clara, attending to the music from the bookcase. At Holmes's signal, the haunting strains of Chopin's Nocturne in E minor began to fill the room. He stood with watch in hand, his keen eyes moving between timepiece and suspects as the melody wove its melancholy spell. At precisely 4 o'clock, he raised his hand sharply. At this moment yesterday, Cornelius Ashford left this room, speaking of urgent correspondence, but observe what I shall now demonstrate. Holmes stepped through the main door, his footsteps echoing in the hallway beyond. The music continued, each note marking the passage of precious seconds while the assembled company waited with barely concealed anxiety. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Lady Amelia completed the 6-minute nocturne and began her second piece at 20 minutes past 4, just as she had the previous day. At 28 minutes past the hour, the exact moment when witnesses claimed to see Ashford return, the door remained closed. Only at 32 minutes past 4 did Holmes reappear, his face flushed with exertion and his normally immaculate appearance dishevelled. Even at a pace that would disgrace a music hall performer, he announced breathlessly, I required 34 minutes to traverse the route to the study, simulate the murder, effect a basic disguise, and return. Yet you all swear Ashford accomplished this feat in 28 minutes, while maintaining perfect composure and social grace. Philip Ashford shifted uncomfortably, his cigarette trembling between nervous fingers. Perhaps the police surgeon was mistaken about the time of death. Medical estimates are not infallible. An astute observation, Mr. Ashford, and one that brings us to the crux of our mystery. Holmes's eyes gleamed with cold satisfaction. The murderer did indeed manipulate the apparent time of death, but not through magical resurrection. Consider this. What if Ashford died earlier than 4 o'clock, say,
20 minutes to 4? Just as he left this room? That would provide 40 minutes instead of 20, ample time for even the most elaborate transformation. He moved to the window, gesturing toward the fog-shrouded square beyond. The study windows were found closed and locked from within, yet the murderer opened them immediately after the killing, admitting November's chill to accelerate the cooling of the body. This simple manipulation misled even Dr. Murdoch's experienced assessment by nearly 20 minutes. Monsieur le Maire leaned forward with evident unease. You speak of theatrical transformation, Monsieur Holmes, but such skills are not common among gentlemen of our acquaintance. Are they not? Holmes withdrew a telegram from his pocket, unfolding it with deliberate ceremony.
I have made inquiries regarding each of your backgrounds, most illuminating results, particularly concerning amateur dramatic societies and university theatrical productions. His gaze settled upon Philip Ashford with laser intensity. You were quite renowned at Cambridge for your mimicry, were you not, Mr. Ashford? Your professor's mannerisms, your fellow students' peculiarities, all captured with uncanny accuracy. The colour drained from Philip's face, leaving him ashen beneath the gaslight. That was years ago, mere schoolboy pranks. It has nothing to do with this tragedy. On the contrary, it has everything to do with it. Holmes produced a small evidence envelope, extracting the cheap cigar stub with reverent care. This was found in the drawing-room fireplace, hastily extinguished and hidden among legitimate ash. Tobacco is of inferior quality, sold commonly near the theatrical district, hardly the refined leaf your uncle preferred. Yet someone smoked it here yesterday afternoon, someone nervous enough to chew the end in anxiety. He moved closer to Philip, whose hands had begun to shake visibly. The man who walked into this room at 4:30 made several crucial errors that betrayed his performance. He forgot your uncle's signet ring, a family heirloom never removed. He walked without the slight limp from that old riding injury, moving with unnatural confidence. Most damning of all, he retained his vulgar smoking habits despite wearing a dead man's clothes. "This is preposterous," Philip cried, leaping to his feet. "I was here throughout the afternoon. Everyone saw me." "Did they, indeed?" Holmes's smile was terrible to behold. "Sir Edmund, cast your memory back to the moment just before 4 o'clock. You were deep in political discussion. Can you swear with absolute certainty that you observed Philip Ashford in this room at that precise instant?" The military man's brow furrowed deeply. "The room was crowded, conversations overlapping. I assumed he was by the window, but I cannot state it with complete certainty." "Assumption, Sir Edmund, is the enemy of truth." Holmes reached into his waistcoat pocket, producing a small silver object that caught the firelight. "A cufflink, Mr. Ashford, engraved with your initials. Found beneath the desk in your uncle's study, caught in the carpet fibres where you knelt to ensure he was truly dead before beginning your masquerade." Philip stared at the evidence as though it were a venomous serpent,
his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "You cannot prove anything with a single cufflink. It could have been lost days ago, weeks even." "Could it?" Holmes's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing the entire room to strain forward. "Then perhaps you can explain why it bears fresh scratches consistent with being torn from a shirt in violent struggle, or why the carpet fibres embedded in its setting match exactly those from the study floor?" The net had closed completely now, and Philip Ashford stood trapped within its inexorable logic. His eyes darted wildly about the room, seeking escape where none existed, while Lestrade's constables quietly positioned themselves at every exit. "The motive was not merely inheritance, though your debts made that inheritance desperately necessary," Holmes continued remorselessly. "You discovered your uncle's correspondence regarding the Balkan investments, didn't you? You found evidence that could implicate him in questionable dealings, and you used that knowledge to bleed him systematically through blackmail. When he threatened to change his will and expose your extortion, you faced complete ruin." Philip's composure cracked like ice under pressure, his face contorting with a mixture of rage and despair. "He was going to destroy me. Years of bleeding me dry with his disapproval, his constant reminders of my failures, and when I finally found leverage, he threatened to drag us both down rather than continue paying. I gave him everything, my youth, my hopes, my dignity, and he repaid me with contempt." "So you followed him to his study yesterday afternoon?" Holmes pressed, his voice now gentle but implacable.
"You struck him down with the dagger from his own collection, then spent precious minutes transforming yourself into a passable imitation of your victim. The suit hidden in the servants' quarters, the theatrical makeup, the careful study of his mannerisms, all prepared weeks in advance for this desperate gambit. The confession poured forth now like water through a broken dam, years of resentment and carefully suppressed hatred flowing out in a torrent of self-justification. Philip described the months of preparation, the systematic study of his uncle's habits, the procurement of makeup and clothing through theatrical suppliers who asked no questions. He had planned every detail except the small vanities that ultimately betrayed him. The inferior tobacco, the forgotten ring, the missing limp that had marked Ashford's gait for years. As Lestrade stepped forward with handcuffs, Philip made no resistance, his shoulders slumping in defeat as the full weight of his crime settled upon him. "I regret only my carelessness, Mr. Holmes. A man who would destroy his own nephew for the sake of reputation deserved no better fate." Holmes regarded the prisoner with an expression that mingled contempt with genuine sadness. "Your uncle may have been harsh, Mr. Ashford, but murder was never the answer to your difficulties. In seeking to escape ruin through violence, you have guaranteed it through the hangman's rope." The fog pressed against the windows like grey shrouds as the broken young man was led away, leaving behind him a family destroyed by greed and a drawing-room that would forever echo with the memory of the most audacious impersonation in the annals of crime. Holmes stood silently by the fireplace, his aquiline features sharp in the dying light, while outside the November wind howled a funeral dirge for Cornelius Ashford and the nephew who had worn his face in death. The heavy silence that followed Philip Ashford's confession seemed to press against the very walls of the drawing-room, broken only by the soft weeping of Miss Clara and the measured footsteps of Lestrade's constables as they prepared to escort the prisoner away. The remaining guests departed with unusual haste, their faces bearing the strained expressions of those who had witnessed something that would haunt their drawing-room conversations for months to come. Lady Amelia paused to place a protective arm around Miss Clara's shoulders, murmuring words of comfort that seemed pitifully inadequate against the magnitude of the young woman's double loss. Holmes remained by the fireplace, his sharp profile illuminated by the dancing flames, as he observed the exodus with that peculiar detachment that marked him as both participant and analyst in the human drama. When Miss Clara approached him before her departure, her pale face streaked with tears, but her composure admirably maintained, his usual brusque manner softened perceptibly. "You could not have known Miss Ashford," he said with uncharacteristic gentleness. "Your cousin's performance was nearly flawless, the product of months of careful preparation and considerable theatrical skill. Only the smallest details betrayed him, and those would have escaped notice had we not been searching specifically for evidence of impersonation." She nodded slowly, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "I keep thinking of that cold touch when he greeted me. If only I had understood what it meant, perhaps." Her voice trailed away into the realm of impossible speculation. "The past cannot be altered, Miss Ashford, only understood," Holmes replied firmly. "Your uncle was a hard man in some respects, but he did not deserve the fate that befell him, nor the whispers that would have followed had this mystery remained unsolved. Take comfort in knowing that justice will be served, and his name cleared of any darker suspicions." After the last guest had departed into the fog-shrouded evening, Holmes stood in contemplative silence while Lestrade completed his official documentation. The inspector's earlier skepticism had transformed into grudging admiration, though his professional pride clearly smarted from having been so thoroughly deceived by the elaborate charade. "I confess, Mr. Holmes, the audacity of the scheme staggers me," Lestrade admitted, closing his notebook with evident relief. "To murder a man and then appear before witnesses as that very victim, it defies all conventional understanding of criminal behavior." Holmes turned from the fire, his expression thoughtful. "Yet it nearly succeeded, Inspector. The human mind is remarkably susceptible to suggestion when presented with familiar contexts. Philip counted on the psychological tendency to see what we expect to see rather than what is actually before us. In a crowded drawing room with fragmented conversations and social constraints, people observe the general impression, the clothes, the posture, the setting, and unconsciously fill in the details. We departed Grosvenor House as full darkness settled over London, the fog transforming familiar streets into alien landscapes where gaslight struggled against the encroaching gloom. Holmes maintained thoughtful silence during our journey, occasionally muttering observations about theatrical technique and the psychology of desperate men driven to extreme measures by financial ruin. Once ensconced in our familiar sitting room, With Mrs. Hudson's excellent fire crackling cheerfully against the November chill, Holmes finally relaxed sufficiently to discuss the case in comprehensive detail. He filled his pipe with methodical care, then settled into his armchair with that air of satisfaction that always followed the successful resolution of a particularly complex problem. "There are several technical aspects that warrant explanation, Watson," he began, sending smoke rings toward the ceiling with evident pleasure. "The wax upon the study door key, for instance, which you inquired about earlier. Philip had obtained a wax impression of his uncle's key days or perhaps weeks in advance, using it to have a duplicate made by some discreet locksmith who asked no questions. This false key allowed him to lock the door from the outside after arranging the body, while leaving the genuine key protruding from the inner side of the lock." I leaned forward with interest. "Hence the appearance of a room sealed from within." "Precisely."
The recently oiled lock mechanism served a similar purpose, ensuring silent operation during the crucial moments when he needed to work quickly without betraying his presence through mechanical noise. Holmes paused to relight his pipe, which had gone out during his discourse. Most ingenious of all was his manipulation of the apparent time of death. He opened the study windows immediately after the murder, admitting November's chill to accelerate the cooling of the body, then closed and latched them before leaving. This simple stratagem misled even Dr. Murdoch's experienced assessment by nearly 20 minutes. "The cold hands that Miss Clara observed," I murmured, understanding flooding through me. "They belonged not to her living uncle, but to the murderer who had recently been in that refrigerated study." "Exactly so."
"Human element inevitably intrudes upon even the most carefully planned schemes, Watson. We are creatures of habit, and those habits persist even when we consciously attempt to suppress them." Philip could mimic his uncle's voice and approximate his movements, but he could not abandon the cheap tobacco that marked his own class and temperament, nor could he remember details like the signet ring that held meaning only for Ashford himself. Holmes rose and moved to his violin case, withdrawing the instrument with the reverent care he reserved for his most prized possessions. For several minutes he played, improvising a haunting melody that seemed to capture the melancholy essence of the case, the wasted potential, the intricate deception, the final tragic unraveling of a family destroyed by secrets and greed. "Psychological elements fascinate me more than the mechanical execution," he said at length, lowering the violin and fixing me with his penetrating gaze. Philip Ashford was not inherently evil, merely weak and desperate. His uncle's disapproval had poisoned their relationship over years, creating resentment that festered until it erupted in violence. The blackmail scheme began subtly, small sums extracted through veiled threats, but Cornelius Ashford recognized the extortion for what it was and moved to cut his nephew off entirely. I poured brandy for us both, settling into my own chair with the comfortable familiarity of countless such evenings. The irony being that Philip's elaborate performance actually hastened his detection. Had he simply murdered his uncle and fled, we might have spent weeks investigating other suspects. Quite so, but the audacity of impersonating his victim drew attention to the very details that betrayed him. It was a gamble of immense psychological sophistication, relying entirely upon the power of suggestion and the human tendency to accept familiar contexts without close scrutiny. Holmes sipped his brandy thoughtfully. "In a sense, Watson, this case illustrates a fundamental principle about the nature of perception itself. We see the world not as it is, but as we are conditioned to perceive it. My task, our task, is to strip away those layers of assumption and observe the raw data beneath." The fire burned low as we sat in contemplative silence, Two men who had witnessed the darkest capacities of human nature, yet somehow retained faith in the possibility of justice and truth. Outside, the fog pressed against our windows like grey shrouds, while within the warm circle of firelight we reflected on the profound questions the case had raised about identity, deception, and the fragile nature of reality itself. "Evil often wears a familiar face, Watson," Holmes said quietly, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "That is perhaps its most disturbing characteristic. Philip Ashford was not a monster, but merely a weak man who chose the wrong path when confronted with ruin. His tragedy lies not in his wickedness, but in his inability to recognize that some prices are too high to pay, even for survival." The clock on the mantel struck 11, its chimes marking the passage of another day in London's ceaseless rhythm, while somewhere in the fog-shrouded city, a young man sat in a police cell contemplating the consequences of his theatrical masterpiece. The case of the guest who attended his own murder was drawing to its close, but its lessons about human nature and the power of carefully constructed deception would linger long after the fog had lifted from Baker Street. Holmes stirred at last, knocking the dottle from his pipe with mechanical precision, his expression suggesting that his remarkable mind had already begun to move beyond this case toward whatever fresh mysteries tomorrow might bring. Yet I sensed that this particular investigation, with its unique blend of audacious criminality and psychological sophistication, would occupy a special place in his vast catalogue of human folly, a reminder that the greatest mysteries were not always those of locked rooms and impossible crimes, but rather the unfathomable depths of the human heart, when driven by desperation to commit acts that reason would forever condemn. The following morning brought a transformation in London's weather as dramatic as any theatrical performance, the oppressive fog lifting to reveal pale November sunlight that streamed through our Baker Street windows with almost aggressive cheerfulness. It seemed as though nature itself sought to wash away the lingering shadows of the Ashford affair, replacing the murky atmosphere of deception with the clean, sharp clarity of truth revealed. I emerged from my chamber to find Holmes already dressed and examining the morning papers with that peculiar intensity he reserved for following public reaction to his cases. The Times had devoted considerable space to Philip Ashford's arrest, though the more sensational aspects of the impersonation had been tactfully omitted in deference to the family's standing. The account praised the tireless efforts of Inspector Lestrade and the Metropolitan Police, with only a passing reference to an amateur specialist who had assisted in the inquiry. "The press has been remarkably restrained," Holmes observed, without looking up from his reading. "One might almost suspect editorial intervention from higher circles. The Ashford name carries considerable weight in financial districts, and there are those who would prefer the scandal contained rather than elaborated upon in lurid detail." Our breakfast was interrupted by Mrs. Hudson's delivery of the Morning Post, which included an envelope bearing the familiar crest of the Home Office. Holmes slit it open with his usual economy of movement, scanned the contents in silence, then tossed the letter across to me with a faint smile that belied his studied nonchalance. It contained formal thanks from the authorities for his assistance in the Ashford case, along with a brief note from Lestrade informing Holmes that the accused had elected to plead guilty, thereby sparing the court the unpleasant necessity of hearing once more the details of that ghastly afternoon. "There is a certain dignity in accepting the inevitable," Holmes observed as I laid the letter aside. Philip Ashford possessed at least enough intelligence to perceive that any contest of wits in open court could only hasten his downfall. The chain of evidence once forged was not of the sort to be shattered by rhetorical flourishes. Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson announced another visitor, and to my considerable surprise, Monsieur Henri Le Maire was shown into our sitting-room. The French gentleman appeared considerably more at ease than during our previous encounters, though his dark eyes still held that calculating quality that marked him as a man accustomed to navigating treacherous waters. "Monsieur Holmes," he began, bowing with continental formality, "I have come to offer both thanks and explanation. Your investigation has cleared away certain shadows that threatened to engulf my own reputation. The blackmail scheme that young Philip employed against his uncle involved documents from our Balkan ventures, papers that could have been interpreted most unfavourably had they fallen into hostile hands." Holmes regarded Lemaire with that penetrating gaze that seemed to strip away all pretense. "Yet you were aware of these potentially damaging documents when you accepted Ashford's invitation to London. One might almost suspect you came prepared to negotiate their return or destruction." "You are perceptive as always, monsieur. Cornelius wrote to me 3 weeks ago, speaking of threats and buried secrets. Nothing criminal, you understand, but the sort of aggressive business practices that appear quite different when examined by hostile eyes in courtrooms." Lemaire's relief was evident as he continued. "Your reconstruction of our affairs, though necessarily incomplete, was sufficiently accurate to satisfy even the most pedantic official in Whitehall." When Lemaire departed with renewed expressions of gratitude, Inspector Lestrade arrived bearing news from Scotland Yard. Philip Ashford had made a complete confession during the night, providing details that confirmed every aspect of Holmes's reconstruction. The theatrical supplies had been purchased over several weeks from different shops across London, the duplicate key obtained from a locksmith in Whitechapel, and the entire scheme rehearsed in private until Philip could transform himself into a passable imitation of his uncle in under 30 minutes. "He admits to opening the windows to manipulate the apparent time of death," Lestrade reported with evident satisfaction. "Says he read about the technique in some medical journal. Clever devil, I'll give him that, even if his cleverness ultimately led to the gallows." After Lestrade's departure, another letter arrived, this one written on mourning stationery bordered in black. It was from Miss Clara Ashford, providing the final emotional coda to the tragic sequence of events. She wrote to inform us that she was closing the London house, unable to bear the memories that clung to its rooms, and intended to retire to the family's country estate in Derbyshire. She expressed profound gratitude to Holmes not merely for solving the crime, but for the discretion with which he had handled the more painful family secrets. Holmes read the letter with that swift, scanning gaze that missed nothing, noting the steadiness of the handwriting that suggested Miss Ashford possessed a resilience that would serve her well. He then filed it away in his index under A, placing it alongside his notes on other cases, his way of closing the book on a solved problem. The deeper mysteries. As we sat in the pale November sunlight, Holmes reached for his pipe and fell into one of those philosophical moods that occasionally revealed the deeper workings of his remarkable mind. "The case troubles me still, Watson," he said, his voice carrying an unusual note of melancholy. "Not the solution, which was ultimately straightforward once the central deception was penetrated, but rather the human cost of such elaborate criminality." He began pacing with that restless energy that marked his deeper cogitations. "We are all performers to some extent, Watson. We present carefully constructed versions of ourselves to the world, hiding our doubts and fears behind masks of confidence and competence. Philip Ashford simply carried that universal tendency to its logical and terrible extreme, donning not merely a metaphorical mask, but the actual face of his victim. The nature of identity. The case offers a singular lesson in the dangers of perception," Holmes continued, striking a match and vanishing momentarily behind a cloud of blue smoke. "We assume that identity is a fixed and immutable quality, anchored in the physical body. Yet Philip proved that identity is largely a performance, a collection of gestures, habits, and social cues that can be assumed like a costume. He became his uncle not by magical transformation, but by understanding that people see what they expect to see. I found myself reflecting on the peculiar nature of the crime, how a man had literally attended his own murder by proxy, creating an impossibility that seemed to defy natural law. There is something profoundly disturbing about crimes committed by family members, I observed. The intimacy required to successfully impersonate someone implies years of close observation, of studying mannerisms with the attention usually reserved for those we love. Precisely, Watson. Philip weaponized that knowledge, transforming familial affection into murder. Each small transgression made the next larger one easier to contemplate, until finally he stood upon a precipice he never imagined approaching. Holmes paused before our bullet-pocked wall, lost in contemplation. When faced with ruin, he chose deception over dignity, and that choice led inexorably to violence. Return to science. With a sudden burst of energy that marked the end of his philosophical interlude, Holmes sprang from his chair and moved to his chemical apparatus, where a retort was already bubbling over a spirit lamp. I have wasted enough time on the vagaries of human nature, Watson. The question of the bisulfate of baryta demands my immediate attention. As I watched him lose himself once more in the precise, comforting world of scientific fact, I knew that while the world might marvel at the sensational details of the crime, for Sherlock Holmes the true satisfaction lay in the restoration of order to a chaotic universe. The case of the guest who attended his own murder was finished, its mysteries resolved, its ghosts laid to rest. The pale November sunlight continued its steady progression across our sitting-room floor, marking time's passage with geometric precision, while outside on Baker Street, London pursued its endless business with that magnificent indifference that characterizes great cities. Justice would follow its inexorable course, and somewhere in the vast sprawl of the metropolis, the remaining threads of the Ashford tragedy would be quietly woven into the larger tapestry of human experience. Yet something in the quality of light streaming through our windows suggested that this particular investigation would linger in memory longer than many others, not for its complexity, but for what it revealed about the terrible consequences of desperation and the fragile, performative nature of identity itself. In the end, we are all guests in our own lives, playing roles assigned by circumstance and society. Philip Ashford's tragedy was that he grew tired of his minor role and sought to usurp the lead, forgetting that every performance must eventually end and that some curtains, once fallen, can never rise again. It was not until the fires of Christmas had begun to warm the hearths of London that the final echoes of the Ashford tragedy ceased to reverberate through our Baker Street chambers. The weeks following Philip Ashford's arrest had been filled with the tedious administrative machinery of justice, a process for which Sherlock Holmes possessed neither patience nor particular interest. He had retreated into his familiar world of chemical research and violin improvisation, leaving me to contend with the inquiries of journalists and the final formalities required by Scotland Yard. I sat at my desk one December evening, attempting to organize my notes into a coherent narrative for future publication. The fog that had shrouded the city during our investigation had given way to a crisp, biting frost that transformed our window panes into elaborate gardens of ice crystals. Holmes occupied his armchair with a fresh ounce of shag tobacco and an expression of profound contemplation, watching my literary efforts with that mixture of amusement and mild disdain which always greeted my attempts to chronicle his methods. "You emphasize the theatricality again, Watson," he remarked suddenly, though he had not glanced at my manuscript. "The audacity of the impersonation, the dead man walking among his own family." But you miss the deeper lesson. Philip Ashford succeeded not because of exceptional skill, but because of a fundamental weakness in human perception. We see what we expect to see, not what stands before us. He rose and moved to the window, gazing down at the gas-lit street where snow had begun to dust the cobblestones. The case troubles me still, not for its complexity, but for what it reveals about the performative nature of identity itself. We are all actors to some degree, presenting carefully constructed versions of ourselves to the world. Philip simply carried that universal tendency to its logical and terrible extreme. There remains one detail that has puzzled me, I ventured, setting down my pen. The signet ring that Cornelius Ashford never removed. Philip confessed to everything else, yet claimed he could not remember disposing of it. For a case built upon such minute observations, its absence seemed significant. Holmes turned from the window, and I detected the ghost of his familiar smile. He reached into his dressing-gown pocket and withdrew a small, glittering object, tossing it casually through the air. I caught it reflexively, a heavy gold ring bearing the Ashford family crest. "Holmes!" I exclaimed, examining the ring in astonishment. "Where on earth did you find this? The police searched every inch of that study." "The police search, Watson, but they do not observe. They looked for hidden compartments and secret drawers, but I asked myself where a panicked murderer, suddenly realizing he held incriminating evidence while wearing his victim's clothes, would instinctively hide a small, valuable object. He could not pocket it, for he wore his uncle's suit. He could not throw it from the window without reopening the sash. So he placed it where gentlemen traditionally deposit small items of value, in the snuff-box upon the mantelpiece, buried beneath the tobacco. I marvelled at this final demonstration of his method. "You retrieved it during our last visit?" "Indeed." I saw no need to complicate the legal proceedings, as the cufflink provided sufficient evidence. "I intend to return it quietly to Miss Clara. She is the rightful heir, and it may bring some small comfort to have this symbol of family continuity restored, even if the family itself lies in ruins." Holmes returned to his chair, and I observed that familiar melancholy that always descended upon him at the conclusion of a case. The isolation imposed by his extraordinary gifts seemed to wrap around him like a shroud, reminding me that his genius set him apart from the very humanity he served with such dedication. "The game ends, Watson," he murmured, staring into the dancing flames. "We have restored order to one small corner of London's chaos, but entropy is a tide that never truly recedes. Tomorrow will bring fresh mysteries, new deceptions, and the eternal struggle between truth and the shadows that conceal it." At that precise moment, as though summoned by his words, the silence of the evening was shattered by the urgent clatter of hooves upon cobblestones and the sharp ring of our doorbell. Holmes straightened immediately, his lethargy vanishing like morning mist, replaced by the alert tension of a thoroughbred scenting the track. "A late visitor, Watson," he said, his eyes already gleaming with renewed interest. "And in considerable distress. If that frantic summons indicates anything, put away your manuscript, my dear fellow. I suspect our chronicles of the Ashford family are about to be superseded by an entirely fresh problem." As Mrs. Hudson's footsteps approached our door, Holmes took his position beside the fireplace, ready once more to confront whatever new puzzle London's inexhaustible supply of human folly might provide. The case of the guest who attended his own murder was closed, filed away in his vast mental archive, but the work, the endless, fascinating work of detection, continued without pause, as inevitable as the turning of the earth itself.